been 70-some years since my last confession. How long has it been since yours? Or I could say, probably about an hour ago I did one in the car on the way here. When you read the writings of the early evangelists, the apostles, they certainly believed in the practice of confession. They thought it was an essential part of Christianity. Now, a question that I have is, does it play a part in our lives? Have you ever heard about confession in a Unity church? I played in a variety of denominations in my career, from Jewish synagogue to Roman Catholic Mass, Baptist services, Methodist, Episcopal. I've heard prayers, of confiteors or acts of contrition where people do a kind of a blanket, Father, forgive me, I made some mistakes kind of prayer. I think in a lot of ways, I never really understood the concept until a little time in a fellowship that suggested at some point in one's life, it was helpful for a person to make a list of all of the things they had done, or a person had done in his or her life that hurt people, that needed perhaps amends, and to not only make that list, but then at some point make an appointment with someone and actually speak those words, to actually admit these things to another human being. How scary is that? One of the things I found out about that process when I did it, I was so nervous and frightened. I think like many of us, I thought it was unique. That the things I had to say were going to be different from anybody else. Probably they were very special. If I committed sins, they were special sins that nobody else had ever committed. What do you think? I remember at one point, the person I'd made the appointment with started chuckling. And that kind of made me come down off of that fear pedestal and say, what's funny? And the words actually were, you, Greg, because you think you're unique. You think you're the only one who's had these things, who've done these things, who've made these mistakes. Trust me, you're not unique. And we've all done them. We've all had errors or sins. Do you know how good that was to hear? It's like, I'm normal. That was the day I learned that I was normal. That was a marvelous moment. And an awful lot of stuff lifted. Now, there are churches that advocate a formal confession. There are churches that do not. I am not going to set up a little chair over on the side and hear confessions. I don't care to hear them. Thank you. But there's one who does. Who do you think that is? Yeah. You want to say that out loud? Absolutely. Absolutely. When you look in the scriptures and you look up confession, and you find it in a variety of passages, and it's used in the Bible in actually two distinct ways. Confession of faith in Christ. Confession of faith in Christ. Well, what does that mean? Isn't that really an acceptance of that you will place your faith in the presence and power of Christ in your life and in you? That's where the confession really means acknowledgement. Acknowledgement. And then the other is the confession and letting go of, the church word is sin, error, mistakes. From the old English term, missing the mark, as in archery, to miss the target, miss the bullseye, to not quite get it right. We all miss the mark occasionally, don't we? How many baseball players bat 1,000? Any? Chris? Is there any baseball player ever batted 1,000? Was that a no? No. None of them gets it wholly right, do they? And why should we feel like we have to be any different? We're works in progress, right? We make mistakes. As some of you know, I taught music in schools. I was trained to be a band director. Meant I had to learn to teach all those instruments. And let me tell you what beginner band sounds like. An alley on a dark night with a bunch of angry fighting cats. Can you imagine the squeals and the noises? I did a program in Cincinnati. I was hired by the Wurlitzer Company. They wanted to try a program in Cincinnati, a trial run, of renting instruments to kids in a certain school or neighborhood, and having a teacher, in this case it was me, teach them how to play those instruments. At the end of 6 weeks, do a concert. Can you imagine? We did that. I had 6 weeks, one day a week with them, one time period a week with these kids. And in the beginning, it was slow going, let me tell you. At the end of 6 weeks, we actually had a formal concert. Now, we didn't play any big piece of music. We played beginner music. But we did a little program, I guess about 30 minutes. The representative from Wurlitzer in Cincinnati was there, but one of the people from the home office was also there. And afterwards he came up and he said, "That's the best result we have ever seen in one of these pilot programs." The kids did awesome. They really did. They learned. Oh, in the beginning they made mistakes, but they learned. I learned sometimes far more from my mistakes than I do by getting it right, because if I get it right just by accident, how do I know I got it right? The next time I could do something different because I don't know that the other way was the right way. Learn a lot from mistakes. Now, that business of confession, gee, If confession, you've heard that expression, I've heard it many times. Confession is good for the soul. I think it was when my mother wanted me to tell her something that she didn't know or suspicioned. Oh, she would say, Billy, confession is good for the soul. My mother wasn't a churchgoer. I wonder why she's quoting church stuff. Yeah. Is it? Well, I think it is. But to whom? To whom? Now, I've had times in my life where I wanted to confess something. What I wanted to do was dump my load of guilt on somebody else's shoulder and say, here, you carry this for me. It's not right for us to dump stuff on other people so that they can carry it, either for us or with us. Why burden them? If I've harmed someone, do I go to someone and do I apologize, tell them my mistake, and fix it? Well, I think if I can, yeah, I think that's a good idea, to make amends and fix something. But if there's nothing I can do to fix something, say it's something from the past, and there's no way, there's nothing I can do, what use is it to go confess to that person, right? But there's one I can tell everything to. One that, trust me, we've been taught that someday, we've taken a little bit of parable, we've taken a little bit of stuff from here and there in the Bible, and we came up with this idea of a judgment day. Someday you're going to stand before the eternal judge, and you're going to be judged for all of your mistakes. Well, pooey. Pooey. In Unity, we teach that every day is judgment, in that whatever we've set in motion by our thinking, our feeling, what we've done, what we put into motion, every day we reap the rewards of that. Whatever those rewards look like. You know, sometimes the rewards look like a challenge because we've set something in motion we didn't really want. And the judgment is that we have to face it. What you put out returns to you, comes back. What you believe, what you think, becomes your experience. That's the day of judgment, when you have to face it and say, wait a minute, this is not what I wanted, this is not what I intended, I need to fix something. And that's, again, in our thinking, in our beliefs about ourselves or others. But there's one, some of you might say, well, it's my cat. I found I can tell my cat anything. She listens attentively. And there's no judgment. She's never said, meow. Meaning, oh, aren't you awful? Never. But there's a better one than that. You can confess. You can tell anything to the Lord of your being. I know that there are times where we may have, at some time or other, in the silence of our being, said, oh God, forgive me for all the mistakes I've made in my life. Well, isn't that good? One of those blanket confessions, right? But it's not the same as saying, Father, I have done this. By being specific, we acknowledge it within ourselves. We see it. And we're saying, I don't like this. I don't like that I made this choice. I don't like that I said or did this. Or I told this lie, or I evaded something. When we're specific, we are involved in the release of the thing. Just think. If you say, well, forgive me for all of my sins in my life, what are you letting go of? You don't know, do you? It's like a big cloud of cotton candy. It's just kind of nothingness. What happens when you put cotton candy on your tongue? It's sweet, but where's it go? It just disappears, doesn't it? Yeah. It has no substance. That kind of confession has no substance. So, when we speak to the Lord of our being, when we speak to the Father within, we say, Father, forgive me, for I've made this mistake. Then we're connecting that I actually did it. We're recognizing what it is, and we're recognizing what we want to let go of. It's for us to make that connection. To release and let go. Jesus was a brilliant teacher. He used stories when he wanted to get across a particular point. And he used the story to demonstrate or to illustrate the points, the spiritual points and the spiritual truths in his story. I'm going to attempt one. How's that? It's spring. And there's a butterfly just breaking out of its chrysalis. The warm sun is beating down on it, and it begins to stretch and expand its wings, and they begin to dry, and it's all set to fly, except it's got something on its legs. Down there is the chrysalis, stuck around its feet. It tries to fly. Oh, it can fly nowhere near as fast, as far, as high as all the other butterflies, because it's dragging this thing along with it. How many times have we thought, well, that's just a part of me. You know, I'm the kind of person who does this. I'm the kind of person who can't change. I'm the kind of person who never lets this go. That's dragging around the chrysalis, isn't it? All the other butterflies get across the meadow to where the sweetest flowers are. This poor butterfly can't fly that far. Don't we fly around in a limited space, limited freedom, dragging a bunch of baggage around with us? Fears, guilt, feeling guilty for what we did or what we didn't do, for what we said or what we should have said. It's tiresome dragging your chrysalis around with you. Is it a part of you? No. But it is as long as you hold on to it. Eventually, the butterfly kind of caught on. He said, wait a minute. This is not a part of me. I don't need to drag this thing around. I don't need this weighing me down and keeping me from reaching the heights and from soaring and finding the sweetest that life has to offer. It begins to shake and stretch his legs, and finally the thing falls off. When he lets it go, imagine, as high as he wants, as far as he needs to go, and he finally reaches the sweetest flowers on the other side of the meadow. I'll bet you that each one of us in this room has some kind of chrysalis we're holding on to, something that needs to be released. Do you need to release it by telling it to another human being? Not necessarily. You don't need an intermediary. You can if you want to. But the one to tell is the Lord of your being specific. And knowing when you do tell the Lord of your being that even before you spoke the words, forgiveness was there. But it's difficult for us to fully forgive another human being, isn't it? I mean, we might do a little bit, we might let it go of a little bit, but then sometimes we pull it back and we hold on to it. Years later, we've still got it. So it must be difficult to believe that God can fully and has already fully forgiven us. So part of that process is not just facing the errors, the mistakes, and voicing them, speaking them to the Lord of our being, but then taking another step. There's in the New Testament, you find a couple of references to confession. If you read the book of James, James says that we should confess our sins, our faults to one another. Well, I'm going to suggest, if you can do any good, if it's of any value, if there's something you can repair by confessing to someone, then it's a good thing. I'm going to do a real confession now. Are you ready? I think I was 10. That would be early part of 5th grade. My school system was small. There were 55 in my graduating class. Most of those 55, probably about 25. Another school joined us in sophomore year because they didn't have they didn't have sophomore through senior in their community, so they joined us, which kind of doubled our size. So at least 25 people in my class I had started with in kindergarten, and I graduated from high school with them. One of them was Della. I probably can say her whole name, Della Durham. She came from an outstanding family. Omer Durham. Homer Durham. Knew the Durhams well. And one time, for kind of show and tell, Della brought some Confederate money. And it was on display in the classroom. I found I was coveting that Confederate bill. So you know what I did? I took it for part of a day. And I felt so awful about it, and they discovered that it wasn't there, and the teacher was looking, and Adela was looking for it. And finally, I confessed. And that was good, because then I could give it back. And that was the most important piece, was giving it back. I thought for 10 I made a good choice that day. Not the first choice, to take it. The second choice, to own up to it and give it back. That way, by my confession, I did good. But that's not always the case. So there's no need necessarily to tell other people. And certainly you don't want to do it if you're just trying to find a way to scatter the load so that other people can carry your stuff. But the Lord of your being James says confess our faults. Yeah, to one another. Well, and I'm going to say, if that leads to good. But confess our mistakes to the one who can hear it all, who has already forgiven. And by the act of speaking it, you begin to let it go yourself. Then John, in the first epistle of John, John speaks about confessing Christ. Not to Christ, but confessing Christ. I think we got two steps here. One is confessing our mistakes to God, to man, as God directs, or to God only. But the other piece is then confessing Christ. That confessing, or to confess in that case, means to acknowledge, to prove, to attest. Well, what would it be to acknowledge Christ? To attest to the Christ, to prove the Christ. Doesn't it then mean to live by that standard? To rise up to where you're thinking Christ-like thoughts, Christ-like love, where you can recognize your own errors and love yourself to wholeness. Appreciate that God lives and moves within you, and it was the human part that made a bad choice, but the divine of you is pure and good and perfect and necessary to this universe. To live according to that Christ, or the Jesus Christ standard, as Charles Fillmore said. We were part of the INTA at one point in our early Unity history. And then Charles took us out because they adopted a statement in the INTA, and Charles wanted them to adopt a platform that included living to the Jesus Christ standard. And they did not choose to add that to their statement of beliefs. And he was a strong believer in the Jesus Christ standard. So to confess Christ is to live as an example, as an expression of the Christ in you. To live loving, forgiving, as you are forgiven. Seeing others through Christ-like eyes, that behold, that humans make mistakes, but that doesn't diminish the divine spirit that's within every person, because the person is learning to express that divine spirit. And sometimes we learn by making mistakes. Father, forgive me. Gee. One of the last things Jesus did, the last things he said, was an act of forgiveness and seeking forgiveness for others. Father, forgive them. And why do they do what they do? Because they don't understand, for they know not what they do. If we truly understood what we did, what we were doing every time we made an error, what we were setting in motion, what we were asking for in life by that mistake, you think we'd keep doing it? I don't think so. Father, forgive us, for we often don't know what we're doing.